Okay, thank you, Magnus, and thank you very much, Catherine, for such an interesting presentation. I hope that what I present will be relevant to what you've talked about. I'd like to start out by expressing my appreciation to everyone who's made this conference possible, especially Delia Pembury-McNamara and Jennifer Macker for your superhuman efforts. Thanks also to Ben Sweeting and Anonymous Reviewer A for their valuable feedback on an earlier version of my paper. As you know, the theme of this year's conference is the art and science of the impossible, which pretty much summarizes my life and my research goals of finding ways to systematically create systems that are both ethical and empathic. But let's start with a disclaimer and a definition. All opinions expressed are my own and represent neither the opinions of my employer nor my two cats. Now, I do use the word ethical, and that's a very dangerous word to use because it gets interpreted in an infinite number of ways. I want to restrict that by defining an ethical system as being a system that is internally constrained to exhibit behavior, only exhibit behavior that is acceptable in the society in which the system exists. I exclude and avoid all philosophical interpretations, but let's move on. The original definition of cybernetics was made by Norbert Wiener in 1948 as the scientific study of control and communication. He did qualify that with in the animal and the machine, which is superfluous for the definition and was only necessary as a clarification for the title of his book, Cybernetics. Now, I acknowledge that the roots of cybernetics go much further back in time than his definition, but his definition is all that we need at this stage, and we will return to it several times during this presentation. So now that we've ignored everything that happened before he published his book, we're going to ignore absolutely everything that happened in the 26 years following the publication of his magnificent book. So let's step into a time machine to jump straight to 1974, when I was 11 years old and a big fan of Doctor Who. Okay, here we are in 1974. And Heinz von Foerster defined orders of cybernetics in terms of observations. First order cybernetics as the cybernetics of observed systems, and second order cybernetics as the cybernetics of observing systems. Now, although Heinz might have originally only intended it to distinguish between two different ways of performing cybernetics, it has been widely generalized to describe different types of systems, which has given meaning to the terms first order system and second order system, which we can express more formally as an observer of a system and an observer of an observer of a system. Now, actually, although Heinz provided the one definition, it appears that he seemed to prefer the definition of second order cybernetics as the cybernetics of cybernetics. And that is the interpretation which seems to have dominated second order cybernetics. But there are problems with these observers. When second order cybernetics is defined as the cybernetics of cybernetics, the semantics can be written as C of C, cybernetics of cybernetics, which has been equated with an observer of an observer. And von Foerster's definitions of first order cybernetics and second order cybernetics revolve very much around the cybernetician and his observations. So we will refer to his interpretation as an observer-centric paradigm. However, the purpose of each observer is undefined, which makes it maximally ambiguous. And also taking this view, we've lost the grounding reference to reality of a real system S. And this reinforces a cognitive bias of assuming that all observers are intelligent observers. And such assumptions can lead to groupthink, where other valid possibilities are effectively rendered invisible or even taboo. So the interpretation of second-order cybernetics as the cybernetics of cybernetics effectively forked a philosophy of cybernetics, which has rather dominated the cybernetic narrative for the last 47 years and has resulted in groupthink, which has suppressed the equally valid science of cybernetics narrative. And as radical constructivists will appreciate, there is not one correct way to interpret orders of cybernetics. And just because Heinz provided the first definitions of first-order cybernetics and second-order cybernetics does not mean that his interpretation is more correct than others. And Heinz actually opened the floodgates, and suddenly everyone felt entitled to offer alternative definitions, which is unusual for a science, but does reflect the extreme diversity and inclusiveness of the cybernetics community. We're not going to dwell on these alternative definitions, except to remark that they are all meaningful, valid, and valuable. But having two orders of cybernetics raises a very obvious question. Is a third-order cybernetics possible? And regarding this, Heinz was very definite. In a 1990 interview, von Foerster said, "It would not create anything new, because by ascending into second order, as Aristotle would say, one has stepped into the circle that closes upon itself. One has stepped into the domain of concepts that apply to themselves." And in 2008, Ranulph Glanville wrote that we might claim we are in effect creating a third order system, which we can, however, collapse into a first order one, because the observing is of the first order type, no matter what type of the observed system is. However, Ranulph did leave the door open to the possibility of third order cybernetics, when he wrote, "There may be reasons to add to the number of orders of cybernetics, although neither I nor von Foerster, for similar reasons, see a reason for more than two." Now, when we look at this, we can see that Heinz's claim is more philosophical than scientific. Ranulph's claim is clearly based on an observer-centric perspective, but it's clear that there are problems imagining a third order. Due to a cognitive bias towards considering all observers as intelligent observers, and because the purpose of the observers are not specified, it's tempting to think of third-order cybernetics as an observer of an observer of an observer, which has 3 degrees of uncertainty and becomes meaningless. It is worthy of rejection, as indeed Heinz and Ranulph both did. But whereas Heinz effectively produced his definitions out of thin air and without rigorous justification, we will try to raise the bar by creating a new paradigm rigorously and from first principles. Von Foerster's paradigm is observer-centric, but given Wiener's original definition of cybernetics as the scientific study of control and communication, cybernetics is fundamentally about regulation, not observation. So let's specify a regulator from first principles. I apologize for the typo in the title. If we start out with a system S, someone observes that it needs to be regulated, and that's going to need a regulator R. And the regulator R must have some well-defined purpose P. Now, the good regulator theorem tells us that for the regulator R to be effective at achieving purpose P, it's going to need a model M, which models the regulated system. And a fundamental feature of a model is that it requires observations as inputs. And this brings into existence the need for an observer to exist. But that observer is not an abstract observer that might observe anything or everything. the observer is defined very precisely by the needs of the model. The model has certain input parameters, and the observer need only make observations to provide the model with those parameters. Now, by being systematic, we're explicitly specifying everything that is left unstated in the observer-centric paradigm, but people can have different assumptions. It's important to surface them so that you can identify differences, and some careless assumptions can cause serious consequences. For example, assuming that all observers are intelligent observers is an easy mistake that can bias you towards philosophical interpretations. But we're trying to be systematic, so our observer is not an intelligent observer. We require a separate element, I, which provides intelligence that is necessary to make decisions. And once the intelligence has selected an action or communication, we then need a control channel which can transmit the selected action or communication to the regulated system S. And I put to you that this is a well-defined regulator. But let's take another look at orders of cybernetics. Von Foerster's paradigm is about orders of observation. And according to von Foerster himself, it's limited to 2 orders. But given Wiener's original definition of cybernetics as the scientific study of control and communication, cybernetics is fundamentally about regulation, not observation. So orders of cybernetics can also be interpreted as orders of regulation. And it is clear that a first-order cybernetics can be used to create a simple regulator, R1, that regulates a system. And that regulator requires a model, M1, and M1 is necessary. It's used to make probabilistic predictions about the regulated system S. When we come to second-order cybernetics, which is reflexive, it can be used to create a reflexive regulator, R2, that regulates R1. R2 also has a model, but it's very different to M1. The model M2 models the regulator itself, which provides self-knowledge of its possible variety, and the observer is making self-observations. Now, when we look at this, we must conclude that second-order cybernetics is not ethically adequate. Creating an ethical system is optional. Second-order cybernetics can be used equally for evil or for good. So second-order cybernetics is not constrained to obey laws or ethics, and that requires a third-order regulator. A third-order regulator, R3, regulates a second-order regulator, R2, and it has a purpose, P3, to constrain R2 to behave ethically. Now, this requires a model, M3, which is a model of acceptable or ethical outcomes. You cannot it is impossible to create an ethical system, whether it's an AI, a person, a committee. It's impossible to make that ethical without having a model of what is ethical or what is acceptable. And the observer O3 must make, again, a different kind of observation. It observes the intended action before it is executed. And then, if the predicted outcome of the intention violates the M3 model of acceptability, the intelligence I3 can use the channel C3 to veto the intention to prevent it from taking place. This is very much like the facility that we all have running in the background that can interrupt us at any moment unexpectedly to stop us from saying or doing something that is rude, hurtful, or otherwise socially unacceptable. And by vetoing the intention is not performed, and it forces replanning to take place. And it's only by having precisely defined models and therefore precisely defined observers that it becomes clear that each level of regulation requires a new type of model and a new type of observer. So the R3 regulation mechanism can be used to construct ethical systems, but it also has implications for survival. The name ethical regulator emphasizes the highest purpose of the R3 regulator, but the M3 model is just a representation for deciding whether a behavior or situation is acceptable or unacceptable. So in humans and animals, M3 must include probable injury or death of the individual as unacceptable outcomes, which makes the R3 regulation mechanism a key advantage for survival. Now let's see how the R3 regulation mechanism hypothesis relates to human neurology. In humans, the R3 regulation mechanism functions at an executive level, controlling motivational salience. Observer 03 monitors the intended action, and based on the M3 model of acceptability of the anticipated outcome, I3 can use C3 to provide one of three possible feedback signals. An unacceptable outcome is immediately vetoed to force replanning. An especially good outcome, such as sex or money, causes enthusiasm and immediate decisive execution of the intention. And if the outcome is merely acceptable, it's ignored to allow execution by default after a delay. And in 2008, functional magnetic resonance imaging has shown that decisions can be detected in the cortex up to 10 seconds before entering conscious awareness or being executed. So there's neurological evidence that supports the R3 regulation mechanism hypothesis. But can it explain empathy? In humans, the C3 messages are not cognitive. They're visceral feelings of fear, enthusiasm, or indifference, which suggests that they're transmitted chemically, not electrically. Candidate molecules that might be involved in this mechanism include the stress hormone cortisol, the reward neurotransmitter dopamine, and the energy stimulant adrenaline. If a person's M3 model of acceptable outcomes extends to the protection of others and not just the individual themselves, that is a basis for empathy. It is also conceivable that the M3 model can provide emotional acceptability predictions based on activated mirror neurons. And we really must stop exposing children to images of death and suffering while their M3 models are being formed and have plasticity. Otherwise, when they develop unempathic M3 models that do not regard negative outcomes for others as being unacceptable, they will be more likely to exhibit behavior that is sociopathic or psychopathic. And compared to pre-internet childhoods, we are mass traumatizing our children, which is predictably will have a very systematically negative consequences at all levels in society and environmentally. Now, let's return to ethics. Some of you are familiar with my previous paper, Ethical Regulators and Superethical Systems. If you don't know it, you can get a copy via my ashby.de website. The Ethical Regulator Theorem identified 9 requisite properties that are necessary and sufficient for a system to exhibit ethical behavior. And there is indeed a 100% compatibility with the model-centric paradigm. The M1 model provides requisite predictability. The M2 model provides reflexive knowledge about the requisite variety of the regulator. And the M3 model provides requisite ethics in the form of a model of acceptable outcomes. Influence corresponds to the control channel of the R1 regulator, and the ERT properties of truth, purpose, and intelligence map onto the observer's purpose and intelligence components in the regulation stack. So there is a 100% compatibility between the new model-centric cybernetics paradigm and the ethical regulator theorem. Now we're approaching the end of the presentation, so I'd like to turn now to my summary and conclusions. In the observer-centric paradigm, the purpose of the observers are open to different interpretations. We start out with no significant ambiguity in first order, which we can interpret as observing a system or regulating a system. But the ambiguity starts when we consider second order. Heinz seemed to prefer the definition cybernetics of cybernetics, which is shown here as C of C. This is often equated with an observer making observations of an observer, shown here as O of O. And this introduces a reflexivity when the observers are the same. And for me, these are both philosophical interpretations because they have no grounding reference to a real system S. But there is an equally valid interpretation, which in my opinion has been unintentionally suppressed by cognitive bias and groupthink, where it can be considered as orders of regulation, R of S, where S has not been discarded and therefore represents the practical and more scientific side of second-order cybernetics, being about reflexive regulation. And it's important to recognize that whereas regulation is quite specific, observation is very ambiguous with respect to the purpose of why the observations are being made. This, I think, explains the root of the schism of cybernetics into two very different communities, which can be characterized as the philosophy of cybernetics and the cybernetics of regulation. And this schism has been as significant as the distinction between first-order cybernetics and second-order cybernetics. When we try to extrapolate to a third order, we inevitably do so from our preferred interpretation of second order. So with a cognitive bias towards regarding all observers as intelligent observers, the more philosophical cyberneticians are likely to add a third intelligent observer to consider O of O of O. Because the purpose of the observers is utterly ambiguous, this creates an exponential explosion of possible interpretations when that ambiguity is raised to the power of 3, which is cognitively overloading to find a meaning for and requires a transderivational search and has strong similarities to the deliberate ambiguity of Ericksonian hypnosis, which is designed to induce a discombobulated trance. So it's not surprising that people give up seeking a meaningful interpretation and conclude that, as Heinz said, it would not create anything new, and reject it, as both Heinz and Ranulph did. However, that is what I regard as the philosophical interpretation, which has for the last 27 years obscured the other possible interpretation of a third order of purposeful regulation of a real system S. This is a scientific interpretation that provides an answer to the elusive meaning, i.e. purpose, of the third observer, which can be described as the conscience that ensures that a reflexive system behaves ethically. We've shown that this interpretation is meaningful. It does create something new, and it does not collapse into a first-order regulator. This type of system is not just possible, it is absolutely necessary for humanity to be able to systematically create and improve the ethical and empathic adequacy of systems that affect society and the biosphere. We've seen that in the model-centric paradigm, each higher order of regulation requires a new model, and each new model requires a new type of well-defined observer. So ethical regulators require 3 models and 3 types of observers. And it's clear that no system can be ethical without that third model and that third observer that are necessary to give the system S an ethical conscience or empathy. Second-order cyberneticians have identified the need for ethical systems and the need for cybernetics to embody ethics. But second-order cybernetics has failed to provide a systematic process for creating such systems. And in this sense, second-order cybernetics is incomplete. It's an incomplete system, which is a paradigmal anomaly that can only be solved by creating a third order that is dedicated to the cybernetics of ethical systems. To be honest, I think that the observer-centric paradigm has had its day. It has contributed pretty much all of what it ever can and is now exhausted of vitality and utility to solve our problems and carry us into the future. I put to you that third-order regulators are new and important, but credit where credit is due. Von Foerster's observer-centric paradigm has got us to where we are now, and it provides the baseline that any new paradigm must exceed to be worthy of adoption. However, the claims by Heinz and Ranolf that a third order would not create anything new or collapse into a first order one must now be regarded as demonstrably false. The observer-centric paradigm must now be regarded as inadequate, incomplete, and flawed. The model-centric paradigm is systematic and precise. It's very utilitarian. Many guidelines for creating ethical AI are basically just checklists of things to be taken into consideration, which are of no practical use to a team of engineers who are trying to implement ethical systems such as ethical AI and robots. I put to you that this system has the precision and utility to actually be used by developers. And it creates a meaningful and important third order. It also has greater explanatory, excuse me, this is my other co-author. It has greater explanatory and predictive power than second-order cybernetics. So according to the criteria described by Thomas Kuhn's, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, the model-centric paradigm is demonstrably superior to the observer-centric paradigm and must therefore replace it. So what is the path forwards? We respectfully recommend that the cybernetics community adopts the following definitions. First-order cybernetics is the cybernetics of simple regulators. Second-order cybernetics is the cybernetics of reflexive regulators. And third-order cybernetics is the cybernetics of ethical regulators. These are all scientific approaches and would suggest that the cybernetics of cybernetics is actually equivalent to the philosophy of cybernetics, which is a branch of the philosophy of science. And these changes are necessary if the field of cybernetics is to return to the noble path of being the rigorous science that Wiener originally gave life to. Now, there is much more detail in the paper, which you can access from my website, ashby.de. The paper is a work in progress, so I'll periodically update the PDF version on my website. And the paper does have timestamps in the running footer, so it is possible to identify if a version is new. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.